Let me remind you of a few things about Nehemiah, as other speakers have already done, but it's important, I think, to set the stage a little bit for that. Nehemiah is one of the most remarkable men in the Bible. He was born in Babylon, and that was under the rule of the Medes and Persians. And about 50,000 Jews had returned to the land of Israel, Judea, in about 536 BC. And Nehemiah was among those who were still living in Babylon. And he had become the cupbearer to the king, Artaxerxes, who was the son of Xerxes. So that means that Esther had been one of the queens of the father of Artaxerxes. So she had already been involved before Nehemiah came along. Through a process that we don't know, we aren't told how he became cupbearer to the king, but that was a very important role. It was not only one who served the king his wine or food and maybe tested it to be sure that there wasn't any poison in it, but he also was a confidant of the king. He was there when everything was going on and would discuss things with the king. It was a very important role that he filled. And one day his brother returned from Judah, and Nehemiah was talking with his brother, and he told him of the sad state of affairs in terms of the walls and the gates of the city. Now, this was almost 100 years after the return to Judah, and they still had no walls and no gates. And that was a major problem, because it was not only affected the safety of the city, but it was really kind of an insult that they didn't have any walls. That didn't speak well of the city, and it didn't speak well of God, because these were God's people, and they had returned, and here they were in this sad state. And that really affected Nehemiah. He was very sad about that, and he wanted to take on that daunting task of going back. And Adam Clarke put it like this. He said, he sought the peace of Jerusalem. He prayed to God for it, was willing to sacrifice wealth and ease and safety and even life itself if he might be the instrument of restoring the desolation of Israel. So he was going to give up a good place to live, nice clothes, good food, and everything to go back and to get involved in rebuilding these walls. Well, it was about 445 BC when these things took place. And Nehemiah petitioned his king Artaxerxes for the opportunity to go to Jerusalem and lead in rebuilding the walls, and the king granted that, and even provided some of the materials that would be needed to do that work. And after reaching the city, he developed the plan and got the people to agree to it, and in 52 days they rebuilt the walls. After that, Nehemiah served as the governor of the city for a number of years. And as governor of the city, he helped the poor. He purified the priesthood along with Ezra, reacquainted people with the law of Moses so they could keep it properly. And so he's a very key figure in the return to the land of Judah. Our topic for this session is to focus on 4 times in the book of Nehemiah when he asked God to remember him with favor. Remember me with favor, O God. And so let's look at the 4 verses in which he said that. The first one's in Nehemiah 5:19. And he says, remember me with favor, O my God, for all I have done for these people. Remember me with favor for all I have done. Sound like he's bragging to God? That's kind of the question we're asking this morning. Why would he say, remember me with favor for all I've done? Well, he was in the midst of the building project of the walls when he said this, and he faced opposition. And he has just protected the poor. In fact, he got people who had loaned money to some and had taken over their property because they hadn't paid it back, and he got them to return the land to the poor. And he was feeding 150 Jewish officials at his own table. And for these things, he says to God, remember me with favor for what I've done. Well, the next verse is Nehemiah 13, verse 14. Remember me for this, O my God, and do not blot out what I have so faithfully done for the house of my God and its services. After the law of Moses had been read aloud to the people, and the people had excluded all those of foreign descent, had gotten rid of their wives, Nehemiah went back to Babylon for a time and then asked Artaxerxes for permission to come again a second time. And this was about 430 BC. And when he returns, he learns that some of the Levites have not been carrying out their work, and that some of the money given for their support and for the temple has been taken by others. And so he sets these matters in order, appoints trustworthy men who will take care of the offerings to be sure they're used for the right purposes. And then he says, remember me with favor for this, O my God. Is he bragging? The next verse is Nehemiah 13:22. Remember me for this also, O my God, and show mercy to me according to your great love. He has just restored the Sabbath, the use of the Sabbath. People had been abusing that. They'd been buying and selling and carrying out all kinds of activities on the Sabbath. And so he put an end to that. He locked the gates on the Sabbath and wouldn't let people in and out, and did things to reestablish the use of the Sabbath properly, and says, remember me for this, O my God. Then there's Nehemiah 13:31. Remember me with favor, O my God, he says. And he just rebuked those who've had foreign wives. Even one of the high priests had married a foreigner, and he drove him away. And he asked God to punish them because they defiled the priestly office. And so after purifying the priests and putting back in the order of the service and things as it should have been, providing wood for the sacrifices and offering the first fruits, then he asked God to remember him with favor. And so these 4 verses, he's used this expression, remember me with favor. And so we ask, did Nehemiah think God owed him something for this because he had done so much good? Did he think God should repay him for the work he's done to rebuild the walls, care for the poor, reestablish the priesthood and the sacrificial system? Well, such an attitude of bragging wouldn't please the Lord. And that's not what Nehemiah had in mind. He is not seeking to earn the favor of God by good works. He is trusting in God's promise to bless the faithful. He's really coming to put his service to God as an offering and asking that God accept it as a sacrifice of love. You know, our primary motivation in what we do comes from 2 things. It comes from the hopes we have and the fears we have. The hope for rewards we seek to receive, and the fear of punishment that comes when we've done something that we want to avoid. Nehemiah had served God very well, and he wants to lay before God what he's done as a basis on which he hopes God will reward him. And so what do we learn from this? I think it's really well expressed in Romans chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. You know that passage. Present your bodies as a living sacrifice. That's what Nehemiah is doing, is presenting himself, what he's done, as a sacrifice to God. Present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable before God, which is your reasonable service. Like Nehemiah, we hope to receive blessings from God because we lay our service before Him as an offering. And God has promised that for this service He will bring a lot of good things into our lives. And so we place our offering of service on the altar before God, and we, like Nehemiah, can say, "Remember me with favor, O Lord." Our plea is not for repayment. We're not trying to earn our way to heaven, but we do place our sacrifice of service upon the altar before God. An interesting example of that is Paul. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17, Paul says, "For our light and momentary afflictions are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all." It's really interesting to me that Paul talks about a light and momentary affliction. Well, in 2 Corinthians 11, 24 through 27, Paul lists some of those things that were a light and momentary affliction. You remember that passage. He says in that passage that he has had many afflictions before God. He said he'd been in prison. He had been flogged, exposed to death again and again. 5 times he's had 39 lashes. 3 times beaten with rods. Once he'd been stoned. He'd had a night and day in the open sea. He had been in danger from rivers and bandits and his own countrymen and from Gentiles. He says he'd been in danger in the city, in the country, from false brethren. He had labored and toiled, been without sleep, been hungry and tired and cold and naked, concerned for all the churches. And to keep me from being conceited, he had a thorn in the flesh. And yet he says, "For Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecution, and difficulties." That's not exactly what we would call a light affliction, is it? But when we compare that with what we have done, then we certainly can see how Paul could have laid before the Lord these things, not in pride, but in humility. And so our plea is for mercy and not for repayment. And we place on the altar before God not only our worship and praise, but also our lives. You know, you can think of many examples, and I can too, of people who do these things that they can place on an altar before God. We think of people who study the Bible with their children. We think of someone who visits the hospital to take food to the poor, teach a Bible class, visit somebody in prison, invite neighbors to church, take food to those who have lost a loved one, go with the teens on a trip, help prepare vacation Bible school. These are services that we can lay before God on the altar. And when we do these things, we can say, "Remember me with favor, O Lord. This is how Nehemiah used that expression. Let me give a couple of other examples that would show us how people can lay on the altar their service before God. I know a man who is a teacher at Oklahoma Christian University, has a full-time job doing that, but he spends about 15 hours a week at Capitol Hill Church of Christ, our inner city work here. He goes there on Sunday afternoons for their service, and on Thursday night for their service. He sees that all the classes have teachers. He sees that that the service goes well, that there's food on those occasions to feed those who come. He hires about 10 interns for work each summer and oversees their work. Spends a lot of time and effort in doing that work that he can lay before the Lord and say, remember me with favor, O Lord. There's a woman at Memorial Road who was taking exercise at the Y. And she said to one of the women there that she was exercising with, why don't you come to church with me sometime? She jumped that barrier that so many people seem to have about inviting somebody to church. And the woman came. And she liked it because there was a lot of Bible in the teaching. And she brought her husband. And he liked it because there was a lot of Bible in the teaching. And they went to a Wednesday night class on parenting that studied what the Bible says about parenting. And before long, the man said, I want to be baptized. And he was baptized. His wife wasn't baptized that night. She said, I'm not quite ready. But in a few more months, she was baptized. And so that couple has been baptized into Christ, and they're very faithful. They're now in a private Bible study with somebody to learn more about the Bible. And I believe that woman can lay that invitation on the altar and say, remember me with favor, O Lord. Well, in addition to the way Nehemiah said these words, we could use them in a different way as well when we suffer afflictions and we have financial loss or lose a loved one or have surgery or care for a family member or have other difficulties of that sort. We hope for something better. And in that affliction, we can say, remember me with favor, O Lord. A lot of different ways to use that expression. It's a wonderful way to say something to the Lord. So when Nehemiah used this, he wasn't patting himself on the back for how much he had done for God. He wasn't bragging. He wasn't seeking to earn God's favor. What Nehemiah means is that he's glad that he had an opportunity to do something for God, and he places his service on the altar before him as a way of expressing gratitude to God for what he's done for him. Well, I think we can all say with Nehemiah, remember me with favor, O Lord. And when we do that, we place on the altar what we've been able to do for him, and by doing that, we show appreciation for what God has done for us. As a way of remembering this, I'd like for all of us to say it together. So on the screen, it says, remember me with favor, O Lord. Now let's all say it together. Remember me with favor, O Lord. Do it again. Remember me with favor, O Lord. And so we follow Nehemiah's example of doing what we can for the Lord. Grateful that we have the opportunities to serve Him. He's done so much for us, we want to do something for Him, even though it's certainly not in any way equal what He's done for us. But we want to do something back for the Lord. And when we do that, we can say, remember me with favor, O Lord.